Okay, Dina, there is so much information. Or let me just restate that. There is not so much information on the topic we're talking about today, which is exactly why we're talking about it. And we have the one of, I mean, I would say a fantastic resource, great experts on this topic in addition to other things. But today we're talking to Roxanne Vogel. She is a PhD, Director of Research and Education at GU Energy Labs. So listeners, you'll understand why I just introed her like this, because we're talking about high carb feeding and gut training. Super popular. We're just on the cusp of what the heck is it? How do I do it? Do I need to do it? Do I even need to worry about it? So today, Dina and I are chatting with Roxanne and just dipping into a little bit of her specialty and kind of talking about what she's seeing both personally as an athlete and professionally as the director of research at GU Energy Lab. So, Roxanne, thank you for joining us today.
My absolute pleasure. It's good to be with you both again.
Yeah, thank you. And again, stating listeners, we actually had Roxanne on 4 years ago, and it was episode 10, which is crazy. It was that long ago.
I
But
know.
yes, and a lot has happened. And Roxanne, we want to just kind of start because we know in that time since we talked last, you actually received your PhD. Tell us from then, like what major things did you take away from that experience, and how are you using those in your position now at GU Energy?
Yeah, that's right. So I did my PhD in exercise physiology, actually down in Australia, which was a whole thing because it was
Oh,
during the pandemic when I
oh my
started.
gosh.
So it was challenging to get it done, but here we are. I got it done. But I think one of the key things or takeaways from doing my PhD is really being able to translate research done in the lab under very controlled settings or ideal settings even, and making that leap to a practical application. You know, athletes are often exercising in scenarios that are far from ideal, and so those lab type scenarios don't apply in a one-to-one manner. So really being able to pick out the things that can translate and then being able to apply those in a way that makes sense for athletes and meet them where they're at. I think that's one of the big things I took away. And then also, just being able to take a critical eye and look at other research studies, coming out of other labs and understanding that some of the things may or may not be applicable to the athletes that you're working with, right? Like it's very context specific. Like, are you working with elites? Are you working with men? Are you working with women? What were the conditions? Like, what were the controls? Was it well controlled? There's so much that can determine the quality of a study and also its applicability to the larger population and, depending on who you're working with, to your athletes.
Roxanne, I always appreciate your higher level way of kind of looking at research and science, but then just how you are rigorous and robust in the way in which you even talk about it is amazing. And the work that you do is fantastic. And I'm thinking of this topic that we're talking about today, which we're like gut training, which since we last saw you has really kind of come to the surface so much here in fueling athletes and things. And I think there's still even, what are we even talking about with gut training? I wonder if we could just start there with like this concept and add in whatever you think is relevant here or things that maybe aren't on the mainstream radar in terms of fueling an athlete and gut training. What is its purpose? Who is this for? Or adding a little bit more context to it.
Yeah, sure. So, uh, you know, the topic of gut training is very popular right now. We're seeing a lot of people undertake some form of gut training so that they can really take in more carbohydrate at the end of the day. Like that's kind of the goal of the current gut training craze is to be able to take in really high amounts of carbohydrates, often more than the current recommended guidelines of upwards of, 90 grams per hour, depending on the duration and intensity of your activity. Nowadays, we're seeing people do well beyond that, upwards of 120, 150 grams an hour, and really holding on to that as kind of the new gold standard. So, in order to be able to do that, you need to do gut training just to be able to tolerate that amount of carbohydrate going into your system. And when I say tolerate, I mean be able to take that amount in and absorb it and oxidize it or use it for energy without any GI symptoms, right? So that's the goal of gut training, is to be able to tolerate higher and higher amounts of carbohydrate ingestion per hour. And so, there's a few ways to go about it. We often think of competitive eaters when we're thinking about gut training, because these people are really, forcing kind of the limits of their digestive capacity on a regular basis. And they do this by increasing the amount or the volume of food or fluid that they're taking in. And that's similar to what we do with athletes, right? It's, you start at a baseline. You got to know where you're starting. What are you currently able to tolerate without symptoms? Is that 30 grams of carbs an hour? Great. If our goal is to get to 90 grams of carbs per hour, we're not just going to jump straight into that. We need to be able to titrate upwards, right? So small little increments, maybe 10 grams additional per week or something like that over the period of, say, 6 weeks. And really being able to practice that strategy well in advance of any competition or event where you're really needing that strategy to work for you. So yeah, there's the timing of it all. You got to figure out what frequency and what amount, like what that is. It sports drink? Is it gels? Figure out the mixture of fuels you're going to use and figure out, can I even carry that amount of carbohydrate? I mean, thinking about 120 to 150 grams of carbs, like that's a lot of sports nutrition to carry if you're, in an ultra endurance race or something where maybe aid stations are few and far between. So there's the whole logistical side of it too. And that's, separate to the conversation on gut training. But certainly there's this component of being able to gradually increase your gut tolerance to carbohydrates that you're putting in so that you're able to actually use that carbohydrate for energy.
Do you find that some athletes, they it's kind of like the kid at Christmas, like really big eyes, like, oh my gosh, I want to try to push 120 or 140 grams an hour. But then you're like, oh, but wait, do we know if you can tolerate it? Like, my question is this: do you see a lot of athletes just kind of jumping in and starting without a gut training protocol? Or is the mantra now kind of the, if you're going to do this, we need to allow some time to improve your gut tolerance to be able to assimilate these carbohydrate calories?
I do think there's some athletes who probably hear the headlines and that's their immediate takeaway, is like, I need to hit 120 or whatever the number is that they see. And that's often a recipe for disaster. And you learn pretty quickly the hard way that if you try and jump to something like 100 plus grams of carbs, often it's not going to work out so easily. But I do think there's also a subset of athletes who do pay attention to, more educated voices in the sports nutrition space. And so they do hear about gut training, even if they're not trying to hit those really high numbers. Maybe they're just trying to hit 90 grams an hour. Because, there was the paper back in, I think it was 2017, Asker Jukendrup really laid down the goal and, how to gut train for athletes. And so it's not super new, like it's been around for almost a decade now. And so there is this sense that like some athletes do understand they need to do it. I think the other part that people miss is like, you also need to be able to train with the types and mixtures of carbohydrates so that you can actually hit those high numbers. Because if you're just trying to do a straight glucose or a straight maltodextrin, you're only really using one transport system in the gut. Whereas if you're using blends of carbohydrates, we know that we can actually capitalize on two different transport systems and get more carbs in with less GI distress that way. So that may or may not be like what athletes are thinking about, but it's certainly what sports nutrition companies are thinking about when we formulate these products.
Absolutely. And we're going to jump into that. We're going to get in the weeds here in a second, listeners. But okay, so before we jump into all of that professional and the numbers, because we're going to get very specific, Roxanne, we want to hear what you, as an experienced mountaineer, and listeners, if you don't know this, Roxanne has summited the tallest mountain on all 7 continents. So she's kind of legit, right? Walks the walk, talks the talk, knows what she's talking about. She is an athlete herself. Before we put the PhD next to your name, let's just ask Roxanne, what do you feel personally? What are your views and opinions with this whole gut training, gut tolerance thing?
I mean, I've run the whole gamut, I would say, in my personal fueling journey, let's say, going from being more of a ketogenic, fat adapted athlete, very low carb, especially during my mountaineering era when I was doing a lot of
Yep.
just essentially like it's walking slowly up a hill with a heavy
Hmm.
pack, right? Like, let's be honest, the
Yeah.
intensity isn't super high, so you can get away with doing, slightly less carbs and relying more on fat for a fuel source. So, that was kind of before I got into really trail running more as my primary sport, which I guess would be the last 5 or so years ever since COVID. It was just easier
Hmm.
to run trails around the house versus traveling to exotic locations to climb big giant mountains. Um, so, anyways, I guess my perspective has shifted a little bit. And so nowadays I'm doing higher carbs, training my gut for races where I'm doing, 100-mile races, stage races, things like that, where the
Yeah.
distance is long, you need the calories. Really, it's about maintaining glucose, but it's also about energy availability. So it's a
Hmm.
much different scenario now, I would say. That being said, I've still never tried to get to over 90 grams of carbs per hour personally.
That's what I was wondering. Is 90 the top that you've tried, or no?
Even still,
80?
like, there's what you set out to do before a race, and there's what you actually do. And
Yeah.
there's also a perception
Yeah.
of what you think you did. And all of those three
Right.
things
Right.
can be totally different. But, no, I would say I'm much more like 60 to 80 grams of carbs per hour for something
Okay.
like a 100-mile race, right? I'm out
Okay.
there for a long time, but I'm not like, 80, 90% of my VO2 max. It's much more moderate, right? You're doing some
Yeah.
hiking and things like that. A lot of these are going to be mountainous races. So, yeah, even still, like I'm training my gut to get up to 60 to 80 grams of carbs per hour. And that's an amount that I'm comfortable with and I feel like gets me through with a steady energy level. Um, and I don't feel the need to really push it beyond that because I don't think, for me personally, I need that extra amount of carbohydrate. Like the intensity is just not there. And the risk
Yeah.
of something going wrong in terms of GI distress or like, heaven forbid, you just completely lose the ability to take in calories, like then you're
Yeah.
kind of screwed because you're really
Yeah.
relying on that high carbohydrate intake to really make up the bulk of your calories. So, yeah,
Mhm.
personally, I would say I'm not of the ultra high carbohydrate intake persuasion, but I do certainly see certain scenarios, especially with the athletes I work with. So I work with our elite team at GU, the ones that we sponsor. Some of them certainly could benefit from, trying to get up to maybe 120 at the upper end.
And maybe we go there now. Roxanne, just talking about, and maybe there is a framework here, like someone who is a competitive athlete, or maybe they're just recreational and want to be competitive on their own level, but determining to what, upper limit am I going to work towards and how to validate that. And if they don't have access to a lab or some testing equipment, to where does someone start and how do they figure out like the best source of carbohydrate? You made already some good points about thinking availability in the event we're training for or logistics of carrying carbohydrates or whatever our fuels are. But in terms of starting to think about that for athletes that are still curious, they haven't really changed a whole lot, but they're wanting to know more about this whole gut training.
So, first questions I would ask myself or the athlete would be, what's the duration of the event? Is it longer than 2 to 3 hours? Like, that's number one. If it's like, no, it's shorter than that, unless you're an elite marathoner and you're running like a sub 3 or a sub 230, you're probably not going to need those amounts over, let's say, 90 grams or 100 grams. Just the duration isn't long enough to warrant that. Like, you can get by with 60 to 90, maybe up to 100 max. But let's say you are exercising for longer than 3 hours. Well, in that case, what does that intensity look like would be my next question. Like if you're doing an ultra marathon and your exercise intensity is like an RPE of 6 or 7, right? Like you're not actually burning through that high of a rate of calories because the intensity is moderate, right? So you, again, may not need upwards of 100 plus grams of carbs in that case either. If you're somebody who's, gunning for the top 10 at Western States, that's a different conversation. Yes, the duration is very long, but they're racing at as high of an intensity as they can possibly hold for those 14 to say 17, 18 hours, depending on who they are. And in that case, they might benefit from, again, the higher end of the intake recommendations, which right now, based on everything I've read in this space, I can see an argument for up to about 120 grams of carbs per hour. Like, we know it can be tolerated. We have a lot of, different studies in the lab showing that it is going to increase carbohydrate oxidation rates. It can, allow you to be able to prolong your ability to tap into those carbohydrates, right? So as exercise duration extends beyond several hours, you start to gradually burn more fat, right? You're running through your glycogen stores, so fat has to come in to make up that windfall, right? So we do see with these very high intakes that rate or that limit where you start to actually increase your fat oxidation is prolonged. So there are some cases where it can be beneficial, but again, I think there are pretty few and far between. A lot of this can be at the elite level. We do see in like tour cyclists who are doing multi-day or like multi-week, just because the calorie intake or the calorie needs are so high, being able to just get more calories in throughout the duration of the event each day can help with, again, creating that buffer against low energy availability. So these are areas where I see possibly some elite athletes needing very high carbohydrate intake strategies. If you're carb curious, let's call it that, and you want to see if this could be beneficial for you, I would say figure out where you're at now. Again, a lot of people think that they're taking in more than they actually are, but go and save your wrappers and see how many gels you ate. And, if you didn't finish a bottle, like how much is left in that bottle? How many carbs are you actually taking in? So you know where you're starting from, and then you can push it up from there. And when you start to reach that point where gut comfort is compromised or you're getting a lot of GI symptoms, like that might be your limit. That might be where you need to back off. And I think one of the things that's underestimated right now is how much individual difference there is in our capacity to use carbohydrates. So one of the coolest areas of research right now that I'm following is this exogenous carbohydrate testing that they can do in labs, right? So they label carbohydrates, and then you take in these labeled carbohydrates, and then you take breath samples throughout exercise, and so they can actually measure how much of what you're putting into your system is being used and transformed into energy. So it's the in versus out, like what is that ratio or efficiency? What is that carbohydrate oxidation efficiency, which is different for, different people.
It's so true. And I'm glad you brought that up, because in my work with metabolic efficiency, I've always tagged that as kind of like 10 to 40% efficiency rate. But again, we don't know exactly. That's just based on substrate oxidation testing, but not the tracer studies, like you were saying. Are you guys doing any of that at GU Energy Labs yet?
Not yet.
Or if you can say.
Okay. I will say not yet. It's something I would absolutely love to have our capability on site. I have been speaking with some of the researchers in the UK who are actually able to do these types of studies. And now it's becoming even more available. There's a company that now offers this as like a mail-in kit where people within the UK still right now can actually do this at home, mail in their breath samples and have it analyzed. But I think it's such an important piece of the puzzle would be to know what you personally can actually use from the carbohydrates that you're ingesting, and then be able to build your strategy from there. And I do see this as, the way forward is really individualized carbohydrate strategies.
For sure, yeah. And you alluded to this earlier, just with the transport mechanisms across the small intestinal membrane. And what I think is important, what I think is misunderstood or just not known from our listeners right now, is that I would like you to explain that just a little bit, where, up to a certain amount of grams per hour of carbohydrate can be absorbed, one transport system, but then after that, two transport systems. If you can talk a little bit about that, and then transition into a little bit more of the confusion, which is sport nutrition products now are gravitating towards this ratio of glucose to fructose. Now, that has been around for some time, but I kind of feel like there's a huge push right now. Would love your thoughts on that, ancillary thoughts on that. But talk us through this whole transport mechanism using different sugars. Is it important? Who needs to think about it? And then maybe the whole, what do listeners actually need to know when looking for these sport nutrition products?
Yeah, yep. Definitely spent a lot of time looking into all of the details on this. So for a long time, it was thought that the absolute max amount of carbohydrates that people could oxidize or turn into energy was about 60 grams per hour. And that's because we were doing studies primarily with just glucose, right? So glucose-based or maltodextrin, which is essentially just glucose linked together, kind of like cars on a train, but still at the end of the day is just glucose. And so the reason that we thought that was the max is because we were only really capitalizing on this one transport system in the gut that takes in the carbohydrates, which in this case is glucose, and then transports that into your circulation so that you can, send it to the muscles so it can be used for energy. But, maybe 25 years ago, I guess now, it was discovered that we actually have the capacity to oxidize more carbohydrate because there is this secondary transporter, right? So like a whole different pathway into the bloodstream, which is based on fructose as an energy source, right? So fructose, we often think of like the sugar that comes from fruits, things like honey. But it actually uses a totally different transport system, so it doesn't overload the glucose transport system. So by using those two types of carbohydrates together, the glucose and the fructose, you actually can get upwards of about 90 grams of carbs per hour because we have the 60 grams an hour coming from glucose. And then it's estimated that fructose is definitely less than, but maybe around 30 grams of fructose per hour can go through that transport system. So that's where this 90 gram of carb per hour kind of ceiling came from. And, nowadays people are thinking like 2-to-1 ratio would be that 60 grams of glucose to 30 grams of fructose. That's where that ratio comes from because, that was assumed that was the most we could do. So that was really seen as like the optimal ratio for a while, is this 2-to-1 blend of glucose and fructose. But now with these higher and higher carb intake studies, they're starting to push that fructose up because if 60 grams is the ceiling for glucose, well then where are you going to get that other 60 grams of carbs from? It has to come from somewhere. Right. So we'll do fructose, right? So then you're closer to a 1-to-1 ratio almost, or we're seeing a lot of brands using this like 1-to-0.8 ratio.
Right. Yeah.
Anyways, there's no ideal ratio is really the long and the short of it that I would, for athletes, that's the takeaway is like, there's no perfect ratio. It really depends on how much carbohydrate per hour you're trying to consume. If it's less than 60 grams an hour, like really any blend will do, even if it's just a single source of carbohydrate, because you're not going to overload that transport system. But if you are going to go beyond that, you will want to use a blend of carbohydrates, right? So the glucose plus fructose or maltodextrin plus fructose. And at that rate, it just depends on how much you're trying to get in. Is it 90 grams? 2-to-1 will probably suit you just fine. Is it more than that? You might consider more fructose. And in my thinking and in my working with R&D at GU, I'm hesitant to go too high on fructose because there is this prevalence of fructose malabsorption in the general population. Yes. And at that rate, if you're trying to do 60 grams of fructose per hour, like a lot of people will have GI distress at that point. A lot of people have a hard time tolerating high amounts of fructose just in their daily life, let alone when you're exercising and blood flow is limited to the gut, right? Like there's just a whole host of things that could set you up for GI distress in that case.
I think you already answered this, but I'm just thinking of these protocols and things, and you're a competitive elite athlete as well. And just this question, and that I think this is debated. It's not a linear response, like automatically feeding 120 grams isn't going to buy you this much more time. And that seems to be controversial. Maybe talk on that.
Honestly, the research on the very high carbohydrate intake, so I'm thinking 120 grams plus, we know that it can be done, right? We know that we can get athletes to take in that amount and tolerate it. What we don't know, or what we haven't seen yet, is a direct link between intake and oxidation and performance. So there is not that study that's saying if you eat 120 grams of carbs per hour, you're going to go this much faster. There just isn't that study yet. And actually, I was just at this conference in Europe, ISENC. So it's a sports nutrition conference where they present abstracts, which is research that hasn't been published as a full paper yet. But they do finally have a study that's going to be coming out eventually. We saw the abstract presented, but it was comparing varying amounts of carbohydrate, like 10 grams, 60, 90, 120, up to 150. Wow. And they did a performance component. The
Okay.
interesting part was, we saw benefits of 60, 90, 120 over, say, 10 grams of carbs per hour in terms of performance. So this is exercise capacity, or your ability to keep exercising, right? But 150 was actually the same as, in terms of exercise capacity, 10 grams, right? So there was this
Oh, wow.
mismatch between, like, more is not better in this case, right? In terms of
Yeah.
performance, we actually saw a decrease in exercise capacity at that very highest amount.
Yeah.
So again, this is preliminary and it's not published yet, but I think there's going to be some interesting studies coming down the line. We're looking directly at that link between more carbohydrates and performance measures. And that's what we really need here.
Do you think it's gender specific also?
I think there's a couple of studies there. They did, one in elite males, and they did a very, like, the exact same study design in elite females. And it was comparing 60, 90, and 120. And while they did see some improvements in, like, oxidation, so it was running economy, right? So the amount of oxygen that you're using for a given distance. What they did see was very high rates of GI distress at that highest intake amount, right? So at 120 grams an hour, we saw a lot more reports of GI distress. And this was even greater in females, it seemed. So there does seem to be some difference in how much you can tolerate comfortably, and that might be sex specific. We definitely need more studies where we are teasing out those differences. Sports science research among females is, few and far between, and then especially looking at differences between the two is even fewer and far between. But hopefully some of those studies will be coming down the line as well.
Do you know, in those abstracts, did they actually do a gut training protocol leading up to the study, or as part of the study? Do you remember?
I don't recall, because, a lot of these are just abstracts, so you don't get the full background. I know they did, like, a standardized high carb, pre-feeding, like 8 grams per kilo per day, kind of like a traditional carb load, and then like a high carb breakfast the morning of, like, everything was standardized as real world as possible, but not sure if they did a gut training protocol, which is key.
Right.
Can you talk more on the protocols, how those are shaping up, Roxanne, in terms of duration? And I know I have to consider the type of athlete and what they're working toward, but if you can give some more insight there. You hinted at a few things already, but just curious, duration of time that's appropriate.
And right now, I mean, there's no gold standard protocol for gut training. It's really kind of like trial by error in a lot of cases. But I think for me, working with the athletes that I do, a good starting point is usually, if they don't know what they're capable of taking in, it's like, let's start at 1 gram per kilogram per hour. I mean, most of my athletes are not above like 75 kilos. So it's usually a safe starting point for most of them, because these are people who are actively fueling during workouts. Like, it's not like I'm introducing them to fueling with carbs for the first time. So they do have some level of comfort in using sports nutrition products. They have access to them because they're sponsored by GU. But, starting there as a, 1 gram per kilogram per hour. So say you have a 60 kilo female athlete, then 60 grams per hour, right? And see how that is tolerated for some of those long runs. And this, I would start about 6 weeks ideally out from a race. And then we have to figure out what's the goal for the race, right? So we know where we're starting, 60 grams an hour. Where do we want to get to? I like to, for a lot of the female athletes I work with, 80 to 90 grams an hour can be a pretty sweet spot where it's like, you can get that, you can get it tolerated. It is practically feasible. Like, you can carry that amount with you or get it from aid stations if you need to. And a lot of people just find that this is a really good energy level for them for these longer duration events. And to be clear, I'm usually working with people who are marathon and beyond, right? So marathon distance to ultra marathon, triathlon, things like that. So if we are starting at 60, we're getting to 80 to 90, then it's, again, usually like 10 gram increments per week. So if we started at 60, then the next week we'll go to 70, and then next week we'll go to 80. And then it's like, you report back and assess after each week. Was that tolerable? Did you have GI symptoms? What were you doing in terms of your mixture? Do we need to consider more liquid calories or more calories coming from gels or things like chews? Because sometimes people just don't tolerate a lot of fluid volume, but maybe they tolerate the calories if they're just proportioned differently in terms of form factor, right? So really, it's a lot of back and forth with the athlete, working your way up to, and then I like to go a little beyond what the target is for the race just to see, and also to give the athlete a little bit of confidence, right? Like if you know that you can tolerate
Mm.
90, but your goal during the race is 80, you're like, I got this, right? I can do 90,
Mhm.
but I'm just going to hang out here at 80 where it's safe for the race. Um, so that's really the strategy is, bumping up little by little, week by week, figuring out that mixture of sources, whether that's more liquid, whether that's more gel, whether that's more solid, whatever the athlete likes, whatever works for them. And then, each week kind of checking in, checking for GI symptoms and backing off if we need to. Sometimes you hit that limit and you're like, all right, we're not going to go beyond 70. And that's what it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Roxanne, how, two questions. How early do you start this gut training protocol? So for our listeners, what should they be thinking? And the second thing is, how do you determine the end goal? Like, is it GI distress related? I'll let you take those two questions.
Yeah, again, I like to start early if I can. So 6 weeks is kind of my ideal window. There's some
Okay.
folks who may do shorter than that, like 2 or 3 weeks can get you there if that's all you have. Like some is better than
Yeah.
none. I like to have a long runway so that we can really figure
Mhm.
out the strategy and the products, right? So not just the numbers, but also what you're going to use, how you're going to time it, how you're going to carry it,
Um,
all of those things. So it is like second nature by the time that you get to the race. Like you don't have to
yeah.
think about where are my calories coming from or like, am I supposed to do a gel or what now? Like you just know from practice.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, sorry, I forgot the second part of the question.
Yeah, the second one was how do you know? Like you said, if we know you can tolerate 80 or 90, but your goal is 80, like how do you determine that upper ceiling? Is it all okay, once you have GI distress symptoms, that's the ceiling? Or like where are you stopping that?
Yeah, and that can be a little bit of give and take as well, right? So if you are starting to notice some GI symptoms, then it's like, let's go into what kind of GI symptoms. Are they upper?
Mm,
Are they lower? Is it like nausea and
mhm.
stomach
Mm.
fullness? Or is it like cramping, bloating, and, urge to use the restroom? Because those can be
Yep.
different things. Like it can
Right.
be more gastric emptying or stomach emptying related. And so in that case, it might be like, well, let's not try and do so much fluid, but like, let's do a little bit
Mhm.
more condensed carbohydrate source. And then you can maybe get a little higher as a result of that as the trade-off, right? So
Gotcha.
yeah, then it's more like run into GI symptoms, figure out what they are, try and do a
Yep.
workaround and see if you can bump a little higher. And if you try all the things and troubleshoot as much as you can and it's still not going up comfortably, then maybe that's our settling point. So it's just
Okay.
again, it's like see if you can work around or MacGyver things, and
Yeah.
if it's not working, then
Right.
that's just what it is.
Yeah. And then how does the curveball of heat factor into this whole thing?
Oh yeah, great question.
Yeah.
So all of these things, all of these strategies are great in thermoneutral or comfortable environments, right? Like perfect
Yep.
day, perfect setting, no rain. But when we get into hot environments, like we know that blood flow is even more restricted to the gut because it has to do the hard work of cooling you down too, right?
Uh-huh.
So blood flow is going to your skin and, to your muscles, but it's not going to your GI tract. So often in the heat, we find that people have more GI issues. Like, yes, that
Yep.
happens. But also, we found from research that you're actually able to use external carbohydrates less efficiently in the heat, which is crazy. So
Hmm.
you actually rely more on your own body's glycogen stores than you
Hmm.
would under comfortable, environmental conditions. So I actually just gave a presentation on this not too long ago, and the strategy for being in a hot environment versus being in a comfortable thermoneutral environment is to really trickle feed the carbs, and you might have to
Hmm.
drop that amount of carb per hour total down by about 10 to 20%, right? Because you're actually able to oxidize that much less per hour when you're
Yeah.
exercising in the heat compared to not exercising in the heat. So it might be a little bit lower of a target, and it's more like do frequent and smaller boluses of intake. So maybe like 10 to 15 grams every 15 minutes or something like that.
Would you want these athletes, Roxanne, to be more fat adapted then going in, or would that matter?
I think
Do you
the
know yet?
number one strategy for, the heat equation is to go in with your glycogen stores as fully loaded as you can get them. So like really a solid carb preload or carb
Okay.
loading in the days before so that you have your tanks really fully topped off, because you're going to burn through more of those more preferentially than you are from even the sports nutrition you're taking in. Yes, second to that, I think always having a good level of metabolic flexibility is important,
Yeah.
regardless of your
Okay.
strategy, because if things go wrong, which they so often do, like let's be honest,
Uh-huh.
you
Uh-huh.
have
Yeah.
to be able to fall back on your body's own reserves. And fat is by far the largest reserve, right? Like it makes
Right.
sense to be able to tap into that fuel source. So yeah, I fully endorse being as metabolically flexible as you can. So that is always a good
So
thing.
maybe there's a little bit of metabolic efficiency beforehand, but also like you were saying, to top off the stores, fill up the gas tank within, and I'm just going to throw out a number, 24, 48 hours beforehand, maybe to make sure the gas tank is full. Is that kind of along the lines you're thinking?
Yes, absolutely. It's like do
Okay.
everything you
Okay.
can preemptively to prepare for
Yeah.
the potentially worst case scenario, right? Just be as prepared
Gotcha.
as you can.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Roxanne, where do you think all of this is headed in terms of the research, the science, application? I know we were talking earlier about some of the exogenous testing going on and some of that pioneering research. Can you put your crystal ball out real quick and where do you think we're going to be in a few years with all of this?
I keep saying to the people I work with, I think the future is personalized. And I really do believe that it will just be so much more of a service to our athletes if we can give them personalized recommendations, as opposed to right now, they're really based on duration. Like, really,
Yeah.
it's just
Yeah.
duration. That's what the current consensus is. And I think there's just such a large range, like 60 to 90 grams. That's such a huge range, right? And like
It's huge.
trying to figure that out is challenging at best. But if we can get this exogenous testing to, or exogenous carbohydrate testing to a point where people can access it easily, I think that will be a huge benefit for so many athletes. And then I think even being able to incorporate wearable technology into that so that you can see
Yeah.
like, predicting different intake needs based on the environment or based on the intensity, like, creating this whole portfolio of like, oh, if you're exercising at this intensity and it's this hot outside, like you should probably dial back your needs to this amount. I think that would be so great. And I hope that's where
Yeah.
we're headed. I feel like we are incrementally getting there in the research, in the science that I'm seeing coming out. So yeah, that's my hope.
So Roxanne, I want to I want to circle back to testing because you mentioned that carbohydrate oxidation testing that we're seeing coming out now, and you said like in the UK you can at home test kit. Do you feel that combining a metabolic efficiency test, substrate oxidation test, which is measuring endogenous, do you feel like the next level is okay, we're going to have to combine the carbohydrate oxidation, the exogenous carbohydrate oxidation with the substrate oxidation testing or metabolic efficiency testing? Do you think we're going to come to a time where it's like, oh, those have to live together? Or do you think they'll remain separate?
Yes, I think you are absolutely right. And I think a lot of the studies right now are doing both regardless. So they're doing,
Mm-hmm.
the whole body oxidation rates. So that's using the metabolic mask and all that, like we do with metabolic efficiency testing. So we are
Yeah,
getting that data, but then they're also getting the exogenous carbohydrate testing on top of that by just doing breath samples periodically throughout the test. I do
right.
think having the both and is important, because then you know how much total and how much is coming from what you're consuming. So therefore you can calculate out how much is coming from your own
Yeah,
body. And then you can also figure out like, is that from glycogen stores, liver or muscle,
yeah,
or
yeah,
is that from
Yeah.
fat stores? And where can you
exactly.
optimize that so that you can have a little bit more flexibility to tap into fat if you need to? Because what we know about elite
Yeah,
athletes is that as they become more and more highly trained, they're better able to use fat at higher and higher intensities. So,
right.
like, the crossover point for recreational athletes might be at 65% of VO2 max. But for a highly trained elite athlete, and I've seen this in the lab, it can be up to like 85% of VO2 max, right? So they just
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
become fat burning
Exactly.
machines as a result of their training, not necessarily even because they're like dramatically changing their daily diet.
Do you think muscle biopsies are a thing of the past now, or will those will those be? somehow factored in the future.
Muscle biopsies is the gold standard. Not used to be. It is the
Yeah.
gold standard. It is very
Yeah.
invasive. Not everybody likes to do it. I
Very.
always say I would
Yeah.
totally volunteer to give a muscle biopsy just because I feel like that's, bragging rights or like
Yeah.
table stakes.
Yeah.
But I do think there are going to be more ways to do it non or less invasively.
Yeah.
So using like MRI technology, they're able to
Yeah.
look specifically at liver glycogen levels. Like that's some of the research they're doing
Right.
over in the UK as well. So even though that takes specialized equipment and technology and is very expensive,
Yeah.
I think that down the
Yeah.
line, we're going to see more technologies like that where we can use imaging to figure out glycogen levels.
I totally
There
agree.
was the
Yeah.
muscle sound thing for a while that was using
Yeah.
ultrasound
Yeah.
to look at muscle glycogen. But
Yeah. Where did that
it
go? Did
wasn't
that just disappear?
it wasn't as accurate as we had all hoped. Like I really was like
Oh.
super hoping that it was going to be the thing, the
Yeah.
way forward, but
Yeah.
unfortunately it just wasn't quite as accurate as we had hoped.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I can say because during my graduate studies, I am one of those who said, "Oh yeah, muscle biopsy would be cool," and then I had 5 of them, and I was like, you know what? It's not cool anymore
Just stop being
because
fun after the first one.
I was part of the study, and I'm like, oh no, it's not fun anymore. No. Okay, let me ask you something. So, and feel free not to answer this because again, some of this may be confidential. But as we're talking about gut training, pushing the limit in carbohydrate consumption every single hour with athletes nowadays. I mean, how many grams of carbohydrate in a standard gel? 20, 25-ish,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So feel free not to answer this, but are you looking, as a director of research and education there, are you like, because you referenced this earlier, like, God, sometimes logistically, you're like, how are you going to carry this stuff, right? Are you guys looking at different either delivery mechanisms, opportunities, instead of just we're just going to make a huge packet of goo, right? Are you guys looking at that? Like, how can we like evolve with this research in terms of a product?
Yes. What I can say is that we're constantly looking at the current research and athlete needs,
Yeah.
right? So we are always talking with our athletes, the sponsored team that we have, there's about 50, 60 of them, getting feedback on new products that we're developing, products they would love for us to develop. And a lot of them are like, yeah, I just want a gel, or that's like 40 or 50
Yeah.
grams, right? Just so it's
Right.
easier and I
Right.
don't have to take as many and there's not as much trash, which all of that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Totally.
So what I can say is we've got our ears open. We do have
Love it.
lots of new products coming down the line, but in terms of food technology and food science, I think there are going to be ways going forward to try to optimize some of the delivery formats so that,
Yeah.
maybe it can't be dramatically smaller. Like you have to have
Yep.
the volume at some
Yep.
point in order to get it in. So it's not like a brick
Yeah.
sludge. But
Yeah.
maybe we can improve gut tolerance, right? Maybe we can use some different
Yeah.
types of carbohydrates. Maybe we can work on the
Exactly.
osmolarity of the solution so that it's
Mhm.
not so problematic emptying from the stomach. I think there's a
Right.
lot of work that can be done in terms of the technology that we use.
Yeah, I think it's going to be like a reverse CGM where we wear something like that and we just program like a drip feed, almost like you're saying, and program this is how many grams of carbs. I don't know where we're going to carry those, but I kind of feel like that's the next wave. Like it's just going to be infused, right? While we're exercising.
Yeah, I mean, kind of like an insulin pump, but for glucose, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Well, Roxanne, before we wrap up, any like, are you thinking, oh my gosh, wait, we didn't talk about this. It's super important. Anything that we forgot to ask you about this topic or that kind of excites you that we just didn't hit today?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, for 90% of the athletes out there, and most of the athletes who are not trying to win Western States, for example,
Yep.
there's really not a lot of scientific compelling evidence at this point to recommend going beyond 120 grams of carbohydrate. And I might even say going beyond 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour.
Mhm.
Like we
Okay.
just don't have the evidence showing it's going to improve your performance. Like we don't have that yet. There is
Right.
an inherent increase in risk of GI, right? You need GI distress by going above and beyond what you can comfortably tolerate. So I think really athletes need to consider like, what is that trade-off? And is it worth it for me to try and push beyond what I know that I can tolerate? And then there's also like people still, even though they think they're getting 60 grams of carbs per hour. We've done studies and we show that they're getting in way less than that, right? So like just because you think that you're targeting a number doesn't mean you're actually taking that amount in. So like, let's be realistic. Let's see what we're actually doing, and let's have some more reasonable goals in place that will get you across the finish line comfortably without having to visit the bushes or the porta-john.
Roxanne, thank you so much. This has been awesome. We'd love to do our high five questions with you. Not that you would remember this from 4 years ago, but quick 5 questions for you just to have our listeners learn a few fun facts. Bob, I'm going to start this one because I'm excited for this first one, but I hope it applies. The question for you, Roxanne, is what is your favorite flavor of ice cream or gelato or one of those frozen goodies?
Oh, yeah. I'm a big ice cream fan. Cookie dough, chocolate chip cookie dough. I think ever since a kid, that's my favorite.
Okay.
Nice. Hasn't changed. No. Okay. Okay. Second question. What is one supplement that you cannot live without personally?
Gosh, can I give you 2 answers? I'm like protein.
Yes.
But if you're getting it from all your food sources and you don't need the supplement, then I guess creatine would be the next one.
Okay.
This question 3 is about another food item. If we think about chocolate, are you a fan of dark chocolate, the milk, the white chocolate, the hybrids? Where do you land?
I'm a dark chocolate girl, but it hasn't always been that way. But yeah, in the last, I'd say 10 years, probably like a 70 to 85% dark chocolate.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yep.
Nice. Question number 4. What is your go-to ingredient that you would put in a smoothie?
Blueberries all day.
And not protein powder.
I was going to say, if it's not the protein powder, blueberries, like frozen wild blueberries. Yep.
Roxanne, last question. What is one piece of advice you'd recommend to all of our athletes out there? One thing that they should do?
One thing you should do is definitely eat enough to support your training. Fuel for the work required is something I find myself saying so much to athletes. It's like, if you know you're going to have a high intensity, hard workout day, make sure you're getting not only enough calories, but enough carbohydrates to support that. And on days when you're doing less, like, eat accordingly. You may not need to have a super high carbohydrate day, but really making sure that you're meeting your needs. And so avoiding low energy availability is the key.
Nutrition periodization at its best, which I still don't think a lot of people understand. But, we're getting there, right? The messaging is getting there.
Hopefully so, yes.
I know. Well, Roxanne, we so appreciate your contribution to the field, and love that you went back to school, you furthered your knowledge, because I biasly, we're kind of living through you also, because you're also kind of extrapolating that into our field and making our field better. So we definitely appreciate what you do, especially at GU. A lot of people are like, oh, she works at GU, she's going to be biased. Roxanne's not biased, right? She's PhD, she's a researcher, she's an athlete, she's a real person, right? She gets this. And hopefully listeners, you understood kind of where we're coming from with the whole gut training, carbohydrate feeding, protocols, if you would. But Roxanne, we just so appreciate your time. We would love, as this topic really starts to open up a little bit more, probably throughout the year, maybe end of the year, early next year. We'd love to have you on again just to kind of catch up and, maybe, or once we see that GU product hit the shelves, like we were alluding to, maybe we're like, hey, let's call up Roxanne and talk about this, right? So we'd love to have you back on the show when time appropriate.
Absolutely. And I'm sure in, 6 months from now, things will look vastly different. So
for sure.
Good timing.
For sure. Yeah. Well, yeah, it's going to be race season soon. So of course, right?
Absolutely.
All right, listeners, thank you so much for staying with us. We'll catch you on the next episode.